When we talk about the mirror effect, we're really stepping into something deeper than simple behavior. We're stepping into a psychological pattern that governs how many avoidant individuals relate to connection itself. People often assume that avoidants are indifferent, that they don't feel as deeply or don't care as much, but that's not accurate. What's actually happening is far more subtle. They are highly responsive, but not in the way most people expect. They don't lead with emotional expression. They react to it. They mirror it. Think about this carefully. In a dynamic where one person is constantly giving, constantly reaching out, constantly proving their presence, the avoidant doesn't feel the need to generate that same energy internally. Why would they? The emotional environment is already saturated. There's no gap, no tension, no space for them to step into. So instead of moving closer, they instinctively move back. Not necessarily because they don't value you, but because the system between you has no room left for their participation. This is where most people get it wrong. They interpret distance as rejection, and their instinct is to compensate by giving more attention, more reassurance, more effort. But in doing that, they unknowingly remove the very condition that creates value in the avoidant mind. Because value, psychologically speaking, is often born in contrast. It's born in the space between presence and absence. Now here's where the mirror effect begins to reveal itself. The moment your energy changes, when you stop overextending, when you stop filling every silence, when you stop making yourself constantly available, the entire emotional equation shifts. Suddenly, there is space. And in that space, something unfamiliar happens for the avoidant. They begin to feel. It's not that you've become more valuable overnight. It's that the constant signal you were sending has gone quiet. And that quiet forces awareness. It forces reflection. It creates a kind of psychological echo where your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. From a philosophical standpoint, this is deeply human. We don't fully register what is always there. The mind adapts. It normalizes. But remove something, create even a slight disruption, and attention sharpens immediately. The avoidant is no exception to this. In fact, because they are wired to maintain emotional distance, they often require that disruption to even recognize the depth of a connection. So when you hear that an avoidant only values you when you stop valuing them, it's not entirely literal. It's not that your value disappears. It's that your constant expression of it has been muting their ability to perceive it. The mirror effect restores that perception by introducing contrast. And here's the critical insight. This is not about manipulation. This is about alignment. When you overextend yourself, you're operating out of imbalance. When you pull back into your own center, when your actions reflect self-respect rather than emotional overinvestment, you're no longer trying to control their response. You're simply allowing reality to rebalance itself. The mirror effect, at its core, is a feedback loop. It reflects not just your behavior, but your internal state. If you are chasing, it reflects distance. If you are grounded, it reflects curiosity. If you are whole, it reflects recognition. And once you understand that, everything changes. Because the real power was never in making them see your value, it was in no longer needing them to. That is the moment the mirror finally becomes clear. Now, building on that idea, we have to confront a pattern that feels counterintuitive to most people. The more you give to an avoidant, the more they tend to pull away. On the surface, that seems almost irrational. We're taught that love should be expressed openly, consistently, even generously. And in many contexts, that's true. But within this specific dynamic, overgiving doesn't create closeness. It creates pressure. To understand this, you have to shift how you define giving. Most people think giving is purely positive. Attention, affection, reassurance, availability. But psychologically, giving also carries weight. It creates expectation, even if unspoken. It signals, I am here, I am invested, and I am waiting for something in return, whether you consciously admit that or not. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that weight can feel overwhelming. Avoidants are not necessarily afraid of you. They're often afraid of losing their sense of autonomy. Their internal system is wired to protect independence at all costs. So when they feel an increase in emotional demand, even subtle demand, they instinctively move to rebalance by creating distance. Not because you've done something wrong, but because the closeness begins to feel like a loss of control. Now here's where it gets even more nuanced. The more you sense that distance, the more you try to close the gap. You give more, you reach more, you explain more. You might tell yourself you're being patient, supportive, understanding. But from their perspective, the intensity is rising. And as that intensity rises, so does their need to withdraw. It becomes a feedback loop. You give more to fix the distance. They create more distance to manage the pressure, and both of you end up reinforcing the very dynamic you're trying to escape. Philosophically, this reveals something important about human nature. Value is not just about what is given, it's about how it is received. If something is given in excess, without space, without boundaries, it can lose its impact. Not because it lacks sincerity, but because it lacks contrast. It becomes constant, predictable, expected. And the human mind, regardless of personality style, adapts quickly to what is constant. For the avoidant, this adaptation happens even faster. What once felt special becomes normal. What was once appreciated becomes assumed. And without realizing it, they begin to disengage. Not necessarily from you as a person, but from the intensity of the dynamic itself. This is why overgiving can quietly erode your perceived value. It's not that your worth diminishes, it's that your presence becomes so available, so consistent, that it no longer requires their emotional participation. They don't have to lean in because you're already leaning all the way forward. And here's the part that requires honesty. Sometimes overgiving isn't just generosity, it's strategy. It's an attempt to secure connection, to prevent loss, to prove worth. But when giving is driven by fear rather than alignment, it carries an energy that can be felt, even if it's never spoken. And that energy, to an avoidant, feels like pressure. So what happens when you stop overgiving? You don't become cold. You don't become distant in a reactive way. You simply return to balance. You allow your presence to have edges. You allow your time, your attention, your emotional investment to be intentional rather than constant. And in doing that, something subtle but powerful shifts. The interaction is no longer one-sided. The space you create invites them without forcing them to step forward. It removes the pressure while restoring the possibility of mutual engagement. This is not about withholding to manipulate. It's about giving in a way that preserves both connection and self-respect. Because real connection doesn't come from one person pouring endlessly while the other passively receives. It comes from rhythm, from movement, from exchange, from space. And once you understand that, you stop trying to earn value through excess. You start embodying it through balance. And that changes everything. Because the moment you're giving becomes grounded instead of desperate. It stops pushing them away. And then we arrive at the moment that shifts everything, the moment you stop chasing. Not as a tactic, not as a reaction, but as a decision rooted in clarity. This is where the dynamic begins to turn, and for many people it feels almost surreal, because what follows often contradicts everything they believed about effort and connection. Up until this point, the pattern has been driven by pursuit. You've been the one initiating, maintaining, sustaining the emotional momentum. So when that energy suddenly withdraws, it doesn't just create silence, it creates disruption. And disruption, psychologically, is what captures attention. For the avoidant, this is unfamiliar territory. They've adapted to your consistency. Your presence has become part of the emotional background. Reliable, predictable, always there. But when that pattern breaks, the mind can't ignore it. It starts asking questions it didn't need to ask before. Why has the energy changed? What does this mean? Is something being lost? This is where curiosity begins. And curiosity, in many ways, is the first step toward emotional engagement for someone who typically avoids it. Because now, instead of being on the receiving end of your effort, they are internally activated. They're thinking about you in a way they didn't have to before. Not because you intensified your presence, but because you removed its certainty. And with that curiosity often comes something deeper, a subtle form of anxiety. Not overwhelming, not always conscious, but enough to create movement. Because the one thing an avoidant relies on is control over emotional distance. And when you stop chasing, that control becomes less stable. The dynamic is no longer predictable. The roles are no longer fixed. Now, it's important to understand what this shift is and what it is not. This is not about making them miss you in a superficial sense. It's not about playing games or creating artificial distance. What's actually happening is far more fundamental. You are no longer over-functioning in the connection. You are no longer compensating for their lack of engagement. You are simply stepping back into your own space. And in that space, something powerful emerges. Self-containment. You're no longer defined by their responses. You're no longer adjusting your behavior to maintain their attention. You're grounded, and that grounded presence changes how you are perceived. Because when someone is no longer chasing, they become harder to read. And when they become harder to read, they become more intriguing. The avoidant, who once felt no urgency, now feels a subtle pull to understand what has changed. They may not express it directly, they may not even fully recognize it. But internally, the shift is happening. This is the paradox. The less you try to hold on, the more space you create for them to reach. The less you seek validation, the more your presence carries weight, not because you've become distant in a cold or detached way, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself in the process of trying to keep them. From a philosophical perspective, this speaks to a deeper truth about human interaction. We are drawn to what feels self-sufficient, not in a disconnected sense, but in a grounded, centered way. When someone stands fully in their own energy, without grasping, without needing, it creates a kind of gravity. And that gravity doesn't chase, it attracts. So when you stop chasing, you're not losing the connection. You're changing the conditions under which it exists. You're shifting from effort to presence, from pursuit to alignment. And in doing so, you allow the other person to meet you, or not, from a place that is no longer forced. And that's where clarity begins, because their response, whatever it may be, is now genuine. It's no longer a reaction to your constant effort. It's a reflection of their own willingness to engage. And that is the real turning point. Because the moment you stop chasing is the moment the truth of the connection finally has room to reveal itself. And once you see that clearly, you never feel the need to chase again. And once that shift has taken place, once you've stepped back, reclaimed your space, and allowed the dynamic to breathe, we begin to see another powerful principle come into play. It's subtle, but it governs far more of human behavior than most people realize. And that principle is scarcity. Not scarcity in the material sense, but emotional scarcity. The perception that something meaningful is no longer guaranteed, because the truth is the human mind does not assign value based solely on what something is. It assigns value based on how available it is. When something is constantly present, constantly accessible, constantly offered without condition, the mind adapts. It normalizes it. What was once appreciated becomes expected. What once felt special becomes routine. And this isn't a flaw in human nature. It's simply how perception works. We are wired to notice change, to respond to contrast, to become alert when something shifts. So when your attention, your energy, your emotional investment have always been readily available, the avoidant doesn't feel the need to consciously evaluate it. It's just there. It becomes part of the background of their experience. Reliable, consistent, but not actively examined. But the moment that availability changes, even slightly, the mind reacts. Now there is a gap where certainty used to be. Now there is a question where there used to be assumption, and that question creates awareness. Suddenly they begin to reflect in ways they didn't before. They begin to revisit interactions, to reconsider your presence, to recognize what was once invisible simply because it was always there. This is the essence of emotional scarcity. It doesn't create value out of nothing. It reveals the value that was already there, but unnoticed. And for the avoidant, this effect can be even more pronounced. Because they are accustomed to maintaining distance, they rarely allow themselves to fully process emotional significance in real time. They keep things at arm's length. But when something is no longer as accessible, that distance becomes harder to maintain. The mind leans in, not out. Now, it's important to approach this with clarity. Scarcity is not about withdrawing to punish or to provoke. It's not about creating artificial absence to manipulate someone's emotions. That kind of behavior lacks integrity, and more importantly, it lacks sustainability. What we're talking about here is a natural byproduct of self-respect. When you stop overextending yourself, when you stop making your time and energy endlessly available, you're not creating scarcity as a strategy. You're creating it as a boundary. You're allowing your presence to have value because it is no longer given without consideration. And that changes how it is perceived. Because when something is no longer guaranteed, it requires attention. It requires intention. It invites appreciation. The avoidant, who once operated comfortably within a predictable dynamic, now has to confront the possibility of loss. And loss, even in its earliest stages, has a way of sharpening awareness. They may not articulate it, they may not immediately act on it, but internally, the shift is undeniable. Your absence, or even your reduced presence, begins to carry meaning. It creates a kind of psychological tension that didn't exist before. And within that tension, value becomes visible. From a broader perspective, this reflects a fundamental truth about life itself. We rarely grasp the importance of something while it is constantly within reach. It's only when there is distance, when there is uncertainty, when there is the possibility that something may not always be there, that we begin to see it clearly. And relationships are no different. So the goal is not to become unavailable. The goal is to become intentional, to give, but not endlessly, to be present, but not at the cost of yourself, to allow your energy to have weight because it is grounded in choice, not in fear. Because when your presence is rooted in self-respect, it naturally carries a different kind of value. It doesn't need to demand attention. It commands it quietly, through contrast, through balance, through the simple fact that it is no longer assumed. And that's when perception begins to change. Because the moment your presence is no longer guaranteed, it finally becomes recognized. And as this process unfolds, when you stop overgiving, when you stop chasing, when you allow space and scarcity to naturally reshape the dynamic, something even more fundamental begins to take root. It's not just a change in how they see you, it's a change in how you see yourself. And that is where the real transformation happens. Because at the center of all of this is a single principle: self-respect. Now, self-respect is often misunderstood. People think it's about setting rules, drawing lines, or demanding certain behaviors from others. But at a deeper level, self-respect is internal. It's the standard you hold yourself to, regardless of how someone else behaves. It's the decision that your value is not conditional, not negotiable, and not dependent on someone else's recognition. When you were overinvesting, when you were constantly giving, constantly adjusting, constantly trying to maintain the connection, there was an imbalance, not just in the relationship, but within you. Your actions were being shaped by their responses. Your emotional state was being influenced by their level of engagement. And without realizing it, you were placing their perception above your own sense of worth. But the moment you step back, not out of frustration, not out of ego, but out of clarity, you begin to reclaim that center. You begin to act from alignment rather than reaction. And that shift is subtle, but it is incredibly powerful, because now your behavior is no longer driven by the need to secure their attention. It's driven by the recognition of your own value. You're no longer asking, what do I need to do to keep them? You're asking, what reflects who I am and what I deserve? And that question changes everything. It changes how you show up. It changes what you tolerate. It changes the energy you bring into every interaction. There is less urgency, less pressure, less need to prove. And in its place, there is steadiness. There is confidence. There is a quiet sense of certainty that doesn't need validation to exist. Now, here's where it becomes interesting in the context of the avoidant dynamic. Because when someone who was once overextending suddenly becomes grounded, the shift is noticeable, not because you're doing something dramatic, but because you're no longer doing what you used to do. You're no longer over-explaining. You're no longer filling every silence. You're no longer trying to anticipate and meet every emotional need before it's even expressed. Instead, you're present, but you're also contained. You're open, but you're also selective. And that creates a different kind of presence, one that feels stable rather than seeking, one that feels confident rather than dependent. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, this is often far more compelling than constant pursuit, because what they encounter now is not pressure, it's clarity. It's someone who knows their worth without needing to assert it. And that kind of energy doesn't push, it doesn't chase, it simply stands. From a philosophical perspective, this speaks to a deeper truth about attraction and connection. We are not drawn to people who abandon themselves for us. We are drawn to people who remain whole within themselves, even in the presence of uncertainty. And that wholeness cannot be faked. It's not a technique. It's not a strategy. It's the result of alignment, of choosing yourself, not in opposition to others, but in integrity with who you are. So as you begin to embody self-respect, the dynamic shifts naturally, not because you're trying to change their behavior, but because you've changed the foundation of your own. The power is no longer in how much you give, or how much you wait, or how much you tolerate. The power is in what you no longer accept. And that is where real influence begins. Because when you respect yourself, you set a standard that others can either rise to or fall away from. And either way, you remain grounded. Because the moment you stop negotiating your worth is the moment everything starts aligning around it. And when you follow this process all the way through, when you understand the mirror effect, when you stop overgiving, when you step out of chasing, when you allow space and scarcity to do their work, and when you anchor yourself in self-respect, you arrive at the final realization. And it's a realization that changes not just this dynamic, but every relationship you will ever experience. True value is not created through control. It is revealed through detachment. Now, detachment is often misunderstood. People hear that word and assume it means indifference, coldness, or emotional withdrawal. But real detachment has nothing to do with shutting down. It has everything to do with freeing yourself from the need to control outcomes. Because if we're honest, a lot of what drives overgiving, overthinking, and overchasing is the desire to influence how someone else feels, to make them see you, to make them choose you, to make them respond in a way that validates your place in their life. And while that desire is human, it creates a subtle form of attachment, not to the person themselves, but to the outcome you're hoping to secure. Detachment breaks that cycle. It allows you to care without clinging, to show up without losing yourself, to invest without making your identity dependent on what comes back. And in doing so, it removes the pressure, not just from the other person, but from you. Because now you're no longer operating from fear. You're not trying to prevent loss. You're not trying to manage their perception. You're simply existing in alignment with your own values, your own standards, your own sense of self. And here's the paradox that so many people struggle to accept. The moment you truly detach from needing someone, you become far more attractive to them. Not because you're playing a role, not because you've become distant in a calculated way, but because your energy has changed. There is no longer a sense of grasping, no longer a subtle urgency behind your actions. What remains is presence, clear, grounded, and self-contained. For an avoidant, this is disarming. Because they are used to dynamics where they feel pursued, where they feel an expectation they can't fully meet, where closeness feels like something they have to manage. But when you detach in a healthy, grounded way, that pressure disappears. And in the absence of pressure, something new becomes possible. Genuine choice. They are no longer reacting to your intensity. They are no longer pulling away to regain space. Instead, they are left with a clear, unobstructed experience of you. And from that place, any movement toward you is no longer defensive. It's intentional. But here's the deeper truth, the one that goes beyond the dynamic entirely. Detachment is not about getting them to come closer. It's about no longer needing them to, because once you reach that point, you are no longer negotiating your peace for someone else's presence. You are no longer measuring your value based on their ability to recognize it. You are no longer caught in cycles of hope and disappointment. You are free to choose connection rather than chase it, free to walk away rather than hold on at any cost, free to experience relationships as they are, not as you need them to be. And from a philosophical standpoint, this is where real power exists, not in controlling another person's behavior, but in mastering your own attachment to outcomes. Because when you are no longer attached to what must happen, you become fully present to what is happening. And that clarity allows you to respond rather than react. So the goal was never to make the avoidant value you. The goal was to understand your own value so deeply that their recognition of it becomes irrelevant. And ironically, that is often the moment they finally see it. Because when you stop trying to control the connection, you allow it to reveal its truth. And when you detach from needing to be chosen, you finally choose yourself. And that is where everything begins. As we bring all of this together, what becomes clear is that this was never just about the avoidant. It was never just about their behavior, their patterns, or their delayed recognition of your value. It was about understanding a deeper truth, one that applies not only to this dynamic, but to every connection you will ever experience. You saw how the mirror effect works, how energy is reflected, not pursued. You saw how overgiving can quietly erode value, how chasing creates distance, and how stepping back creates awareness. You saw how scarcity sharpens perception, how self-respect reshapes the dynamic, and how detachment ultimately frees you from the need to control any outcome. But beneath all of that is a single unifying principle. People don't value what you prove, they value what you embody. And when you were overextending, over-explaining, over-investing, you weren't embodying your value. You were trying to convince someone of it. You were placing yourself in a position where your worth felt negotiable, dependent, uncertain. Not because it was, but because your actions made it appear that way. The shift happens when that changes, when you no longer try to earn your place in someone's life, but instead stand firmly in the understanding that your presence is a choice, not a plea. When you stop asking, how do I make them see me? And start living in a way that says, I see myself clearly. Because that is what transforms everything. It transforms how you show up. It transforms what you tolerate. It transforms the kind of energy you bring into every interaction. And most importantly, it transforms what you accept as love. At that point, whether the avoidant turns back, reaches out, or finally begins to value you becomes secondary, not irrelevant, but no longer defining, because you are no longer waiting to be chosen. You already have been by yourself. And that is the highest form of power, not the power to make someone stay or to make someone feel or to make someone recognize your worth, but the power to walk away from anything that requires you to forget it, because real connection doesn't come from chasing. It comes from alignment. It comes from two people meeting, not out of need, not out of fear, but out of clarity. So if there is one thing to carry forward from all of this, let it be this. You don't become valuable when someone finally sees your worth. You become valuable the moment you stop needing them to.